Welcome everyone. It is 2:30 Central. In the interest of starting on time, I'm going to begin this session of the Cognitive, Computational, and Systems Neuroscience Research Methodology Workshop. I'll give a brief introduction and then reserve the rest of the time for our guest speaker today, Dr. Elle O'Brien. Just as an orientation, as everyone's trickling in to this particular workshop series, this is a new component of CCSN. It's focused on how to conduct high quality research. We think of it as the material that's relevant regardless of your research applications, whether you're in academia, government, nonprofit, or in industry. It's part of the T32 funded CCSN pathway that's sponsored by the National Institutes of Neurological Disorder and Stroke. Like other aspects of CCSN, the content's intended to cover material relevant for the constituent graduate programs of psychological and brain sciences, biomedical engineering, and systems neuroscience. But we expect that this content, as I mentioned earlier, is widely accessible across disciplines. And we also expect interest to grow outside of CCSN. So today is the first of two parts of this workshop. The second part two, is focused on current ACCSN students. These are students in the advanced CCSN course. That will happen on Wednesday. This part today will have two parts of its own. There's the first hour, which Dr. O'Brien will use to deliver her message related to research methodology, her topic. And then the second hour, and we'll hold questions until she completes her presentation. If anyone needs to exit the meeting at that time, feel free to do so. The second part will be our extended question and answer session. These workshops are intended to be as interactive as we can make them with virtual format, and we want to give plenty of time for that, that element of the workshop. If you do have to leave and would like to address a question, you can put it in chat. My co-instructor for ACCSN, Shelley Cooper, and I will be monitoring the chat, and we can evaluate those questions as they come in. Okay, so now to introduce our speaker, I should mention that Dr. O'Brien has recently joined University of Michigan as a lecturer and research investigator, so congratulations, that's exciting news. She did her graduate work at University of Washington on something that would that our CCSN students would appreciate, both biophysical models of cochlear implant auditory systems with Jay Rubenstein, and then also the integration of acoustic information in typical and dyslexic readers, children, with Jason Yateman. So a pretty broad swath of the neuroscience and behavioral science landscape that she has direct experience with. But in addition, between these academic research efforts, she's worked in the private sector on projects related to data science, education, and outreach. And she has a particularly strong interest in the science of science, the meta-scientific concepts that we've been covering in ACCSN this semester, which makes her presentation today highly anticipated by this class and the CCSN community. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. O'Brien. I'll stop my share. And Elle, if you, oh, perfect.
Awesome. Okay. You're seeing my screen, everyone?
Yes, you look good.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the intro. I'm really happy to be here talking to everyone today. I'm going to be talking to you about principles for scientific software development, version control, and testing. So we got a little bit of an intro, but just kind of to summarize, my background is in mathematics. I did a, very like writing proofs on paper kind of math degree. I did my master's degree working on biophysical models, cochlear implants, PhD then looking into, speech acoustics and the processing of these signals. Then after that, instead of doing a postdoc, I did a year at an open source software startup, which I'll share a little bit more about. And today, as of the beginning of March, I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of Michigan. And so the projects I get to work on are that I contribute to our applied data science professional program. And I also recently have gotten to participate in, some research for the state of Michigan's COVID response. So I'm also getting into, data collection for an ongoing public health crisis, as well as some modeling there. And I'll also share a little bit more about that. But kind of to set the scene here for what I want to talk about, one of the biggest shocks for me when I transitioned from being a PhD research scientist to, working in industry on a team that makes tools for data scientists, is that it turns out that a lot of the skills that I spent years and years honing in statistics were, I don't know, they didn't comprise as much of the job as I thought they would. And it turns out that in data science, and this is kind of widely recognized as a huge problem, at almost any organization that does data science, a tremendous amount of work goes into tasks like, just engineering. How do you store your data? How do you maintain it? How do you turn it into a format that you can use for analyzing? And so, there's all this section about like model selection, and then, figuring out what model you like and publishing it in some way. And that turns out to occupy for a lot of data scientists less than 20% of their time on the job. That working with data is actually just the data itself is kind of the thing you spend time on. And so this is from a survey put out by the Anaconda organization. They're a major Python development organization. And they found that about 80% of data scientists' time was spent on things, that were considerably below the level of analyzing it. And, if we think about how this might work instead for a lab, an academic lab that uses big data, we might swap out some of those, activities that, instead of model selection, maybe you're hypothesis testing, and maybe instead of deploying a model, as in, when I say deploy, I mean, you take a model and you put it into production somehow. You make it, like a service that's online, you are feeding it into an app. It's working for, its intended consumers. Instead, we often publish papers. But, I think a lot of those concerns about data management are still very relevant to us, and I don't really see those as going away. And so, one of the things, people have done a lot of thinking about this, and there's a lot of really, insightful writing about this issue. And one that I think does it really well is from the Netflix data team. As you might imagine, they have, just an enormous, like their trove of data is just gigantic. And I think they put it really well, that from experience, we know that much of the pain related to operating modern machine learning infrastructure is caused by the complexity of large-scale distributed systems. And to kind of unpack some of this, they're saying machine learning. When industry says machine learning, they mean regular statistics. So it's, all of you are doing machine learning probably. But, there's anytime that you have large data, even when you're working with relatively simple models, you still have to manage the complexity. And when we say, large scale distributed systems, just to put another definition in there, when I say distributed, we could mean many computers are involved, many team members are involved, many parts, many stakeholders. There's several ways to interpret that, but there's a lot of complexity too in who cares about this project, who has a stake in it, who's involved in it, and what kind of computing infrastructure are we using it to get the job done. So I would say that this probably applies to a lot of research that I've worked on, just having had the chance to work in several different labs over the years. I think they all do some of the job of managing complexity, and it's something that I think is often secondary, tertiary, maybe even lower consideration, but I feel like it comes up quite a lot in a lot of labs, and they might not even notice it really, but you deal with it whether you talk about it or not. So, one example of a kind of complexity that we encounter has to do with ongoing data collection. So, for example, if you work on a large public data set or any data set really that is an ongoing data collection, your data set will update regularly. It could be daily, weekly, monthly, it could be regular or not, but your data set is changing over time. And I don't know about you, but something I would often do during my dissertation work while I was, waiting for more subject data to come in is I would sit down at my computer and I would run all the statistical models and I'd visualize all the data I had so far. And then the next day when some more data came in, I would do it all over again. And it was like my way of kind of keeping an eye on, what does it look like? What's the quality? But, if I did an analysis one day and it came up, oh, that looks a little funny, what's going on there? It's possible that if my data updates the next day, then I lose it and I can't go back and figure out exactly, well, why did I see that? And sometimes it can be hard to replicate your results just because of the data set is changing over time. And another example is data provenance, which is understanding and being really rigorous about where your data comes from and how it got to you. So, potentially people who work on something like, time series data or spatial data. So, I know this comes up quite a bit in neuroimaging, but if you have some raw data, you might do some pre-processing step followed by another, step. So maybe you low pass your filter, your time series, then you aggregate your measures within the subject, and then maybe you publish your results from that. And then perhaps after you publish it, one of, a lab in the field comes up to you and says, oh, hey, could I have the data and try my own analysis on it? And you give it to them, and then they will, reuse that data and transform it in their own new ways. And so they have a data set that is derived from your data set. So it could be, for example, that maybe I take a public data set and I transform it in some way. And now I have a data set that has a direct parent in a way. And so, there are all these relationships between data sets. A lot of them are not truly independent one another. And so it can be oftentimes important, for really understanding and reporting and being scientific to know where does everything come from and what are the relationships between all the data files that are on my computer. Another way of thinking about, complexity in code and dependencies is going out of the data, but into your code. So when I say code, I'm just talking pretty broadly about any way that you're going to be transforming your data, any language. And so, oftentimes what ends up happening is that we write these pipelines. So we might write series of steps of code first that we clean our data, maybe we remove things that are really low quality, or we don't have confidence in the measurement. Then we might do some filtering, some ways of aggregating. We might create some kind of composite or summary variable, and then maybe we'll do a statistical model. And each step here, is going to be dependent on the previous steps. And if you are somebody who's pretty into math, you might know this as a directed acyclic graph, but basically we have a bunch of functions that are chained together. And usually this is implemented somehow in code. Although, very often we'll have oh, I wrote a script that does each step and you just manually run each one. But, manually running it is only one way to deal with this. And sometimes, especially when we're kind of in the exploratory phases of a project, we might iterate on this a few times. Like we might say, my statistical model popped up something, really weird. And that signals to me that I am probably not filtering this properly, or I need to set off the cutoff higher, or something got through that actually that looks like garbage data, So sometimes that happens. And then you'll go back and you'll, say, okay, I really I missed something on my quality control here. So your code is changing over time as well. And so, even though we write code, it goes through lots of stages and it often has a life cycle throughout each project. So, you might write a data analysis script. Then you might say, okay, the model that I tried here, it's not that great. I can do a better one. You add some predictors. Then your data set might update. And then you might realize that there was a bug in your data cleaning script. And so you can kind of think of taking pictures of your code at many points in time. And each time it might be a little bit different. And when you don't have this, anything to manage that, what you often end up with is a file folder that looks like this, where you just save everything and you just write it's like version 3. And then a week later, you will have no idea what any of that is. And you just kind of have to go look through. And this happens a lot. This happened to me for many, many years. Sometimes it still happens. So there are some solutions for this. Version control systems are something that can help, and I'll get a bit more into this as we go. So GitHub, for example, is a very common, very popular online tool for helping you version your code. It works with Git. Git is software that runs on your computer, and then GitHub is a place online where you can put, all of your code, your data, and you can put them here and share it with your team, and it helps you visualize all of the histories quite nicely. So some of you may be familiar with this, some may not. That's okay too. And finally, there's software dependencies, which is everything you need to run a program. So, for example, if you have some MATLAB code, you might need a particular MATLAB version, you might need a special toolbox, and you might need some custom functions that have been written by somebody on your team. And so if you were just to give this to your teammate or your friend, and they don't have all these things installed, they won't be able to run your code. If we look at Python, Python is really notorious for, for some of these issues. We have, different libraries that go with Python, and they're often acutely tied to a version. And Python is known as dependency. There's a lot of dependency hell issues. So this is an ecosystem where a lot of tools have sprung up to manage how do you keep track of all of the different software libraries that you need to run your Python code. And finally, there's hardware dependencies, which can be things like storage for big data. So a lot of labs are generating, on the terabyte scale. It could be compute power. So just what is needed to process this. So if, for example, your pipeline is quite intense, maybe it can't run on your laptop. Maybe it needs to run on a special computer in the lab that has a sufficient number of cores. Or maybe you have, a server. There's also specialized hardware. So things like GPUs or cluster compute, high performance computing. So sometimes, you'll need a particular tool as well. And so, this kind of all leads me to believe that in a way, every lab is actually a small software company. We produce a lot of software. I don't think I've ever really seen a lab that didn't in some way generate software. And even though we don't produce services for businesses, or, we don't have the same goals necessarily as like a Silicon Valley software company, we really do make a lot of software along the way. And I'd argue that, we kind of don't really have science today without software. And so it's interesting to me that even though, you might have like a postdoc that's devoted solely to the craftsmanship and the methods of something like, EEG, or you're going to really dig into microscopy. We don't have this kind of emphasis on software, even though it is a research tool that, we really do use at every stage. And there are just so many ways, to mess it up, essentially. And, I would say, here are some of the most common ways that labs use software. We clean and manipulate data, we compare statistical models, create databases, visualize your data, developing a user interface, running simulations. There's just so many. And even if, what you have in your lab is just like an Excel spreadsheet, there are still ways to be programmatic about that. There is still complexity to be managed there. And a lot of it is not that dissimilar from, some of these use cases here. So I think that there are very, very few labs that I think would be truly exempt from, software being in some way integral to their mission. And, I think I don't have solid proof for this, but I have a very strong suspicion that we're running collectively into a lot of issues here. One issue, I know that, you've talked in this series before about reproducibility issues. So the reproducibility crisis I think it has many causes. Some of them are to do with statistical errors, some are generalizability out of sample. But I also think that there's a big component of it that we simply cannot verify how many things could be repeated because we don't really have access to, the materials that go into them. It's really quite difficult to share everything that's needed to repeat your methods. You know, a lot of times if somebody says, okay, I want to repeat your study and I'm going to run it on some subjects, you know, around my university, I could give them my code, but a lot of times it's not really in good enough shape yet that they could use it. And that makes it harder for them to truly repeat your methods and your analyses. Another thing is just that sharing data, code, and modeling results is hard. I remember, you know, in so many labs that I've worked in, you know, we would say, oh, I'll send you what I did, only to discover that my code does not work on, you know, our teammate's laptop. And then they have to spend a day or two making it, you know, work for them with their particular version of whatever language they were using in all the libraries, or maybe it was coded up to work on a completely different operating system. And these things would happen pretty regularly. And I mean, that's just a huge productivity sink. It just eats up a lot of time and it makes collaborating really difficult. The same with sharing data, especially the larger your data gets, the harder it is to share. Like, you know, if your data is like a little Excel file and it's pretty static, it's easy to share that, you know, just email it to somebody. But when your data is large, you have to go often through like, okay, I'm going to give somebody credentials to access my data. You know, they have to log into our server. We have to go through IT. You know, or they simply don't have a place to keep it, or they can get the data, but they really can't understand it because we don't have a dictionary of like what's in here and what a new person would need to understand this. Another issue I see is that it just is difficult to take advantage of compute resources. A lot of labs, I think they have you know, they have the domain expertise that they would really benefit from being able to scale up their data collection, you know, perhaps over, you know, I feel like the pandemic, at least in, you know, kind of my home field of acoustics, we've really leaned into how can we create, you know, psychophysics that work over a browser. And that just drastically increases the number of, you know, data points that you can get, but taking advantage perhaps of, you know, the computational tools that let you work on that scale is just out of reach for a lot of labs. And that can be things like cloud compute's quite hard. And if you're stuck using only the computers that are around your, you know, around your lab, you are limited in some way. And, you know, this kind of goes into my last point that I talk a lot to groups that have a sense that they could be getting into big data and machine learning, which, like I said, very often means we just want a higher volume of data collection, and then that will allow us to explore models, you know, with a bit more certainty, smaller confidence intervals maybe. But they don't quite know how to get there. And I guess what I see is even though the reproducibility crisis is a big problem, I think I'm actually more alarmed by the potentially huge opportunity costs for labs that have excellent domain expertise, but aren't able to take advantage or create things like multi-site collaboration, large-scale data collection, and resource sharing. And so, I mean, collectively, all of the scientific enterprise is worse off for not being able to, you know, create communal resources that are easy to share. And part of this, I think, is that labs are built to make papers, not code, but the papers do rest acutely on your code and on your data. And it just, I think it adds up to a huge cost over time. I can't quantify how big a problem this is. I'd love to figure out a way, but I don't know. It's just like a kind of feeling I have after visiting, you know, a lot of labs and seeing that it's totally separate from, you know, the talent or the quality of the research almost that's in each side lab. It just seems like it's a bigger problem. So I had, you know, in my year out working at an open source software startup, I did get a window into how things look out there. And it was really different. And, you know, in some ways kind of shocking. So one of them is that everybody works from a central code repository. So for example, we would all work from GitHub. And even though I have worked in labs where we do use GitHub, the way we often use it is more like a file server where we just kind of upload our code when we're all done with it. But GitHub actually allows several people to be working, you know, developing features at once. And then it helps you, you know, figure out, okay, how's my version, you know, compared to everybody else's on the team. And it kind of gives us a central single source of truth is the phrase that I would often hear, you know, thrown around. And so this is quite different from, you know, perhaps emailing code to one another, where we might say like, oh, I have my version, my teammate has her version, but which one is really the true version? It's not sure. And how are they related to each other? You don't know. You just have to go back to your email and figure it out. But using a centralized code repository with some kind of version control, it really changes the workflow. And related to that, we record the lineage, I'm not sure which it is, of each code version. So you always know, precisely my code version. Oh, this one is like, I had, Jessica's code version, and then I changed this line and I changed it on this day. And so if we were getting results that were different prior to this day, we can always go back and see. And we know how everybody's versions are related to one another, which again is pretty different from, kind of the convention of, oh, we email around and figure out who has the code at any given time and who has the most updated version or the most recent. Another difference is code is built to work on many machines. Please excuse that this is just a stock photo with obvious stock photo watermarks on it. I just thought I liked its energy. But we write code with the intention that it's going to be run off my computer. And some of that is kind of little tricks like, okay, we don't write hard-coded file paths that I look in user/L/my documents. We try to avoid things like that, but also we write with the intent that everything is going to be packaged up and shipped off to somebody else's computer. So when you're writing like that from the start, it's no longer like an expectation that at the end of my project, I have to spend, a couple days converting my code into a format that I could share. And that tends to shave off time. It's kind of shareable at any moment in time. And teammates review one another's code regularly. We actually try to make bugs or find bugs. We try to break our code. And so when I write code, somebody else sanity checks it. And I remember when I was a graduate student, I would have literal panic attacks over the fear that I had just gotten this 10,000 line code base that had been around since the 90s and passed down from student to student. And I would just get these like panic attacks that what if there's a bug in there and I never find it and it affects all my modeling results. And while those things can still happen, the chances of them, they get cut quite a bit when you have people that regularly look at your code, when you look at it together, and when you go into it with the intention of trying to find bugs, which is very different than just really praying there's no bug. And that didn't really work for me. It really didn't soothe my anxiety whatsoever. And the last part of that is that we test code and data for quality. And some of that is things like we have style guides for how we all write, and that ensures that it's relatively readable to, somebody who comes in. We have standards for, how things would be documented. And we test it to make sure that it doesn't break other things that we have and that it follows all of the assumptions that we think it ought to. So, it was quite different. And, there are certainly labs that have high standards of their code, but what I think was quite different was how baked in this was in the culture. And I feel like it was really overwhelming, how much, of course you test your code. Like, it's not like an optional thing. It's like, if you don't test your code, it's not going in our code base. And it was just a very different attitude. And, something else that I learned is that, the way that we have it now, that's very popular in industry, and I wouldn't say it's everywhere. I'm sure there are many, many companies that are really struggling with their code base. And, everything I've said is kind of a best case scenario. But it wasn't always like this. And some of the practices that are used in software development have evolved very consciously based on, cultural and technical decisions. So something I learned about is called DevOps, and it's you put together the words development and operations and you make DevOps. And it's a movement that has seen, it's kind of a philosophical movement. I think a bunch of people got together and, decided these are some of our principles, and they did quite a bit of research actually about how organizations run in manufacturing guided a lot of it. There's a lot of inspiration from the Toyota company in particular about how they kind of weed out bugs in their processes. And so they've, made some intentional practices that go into software software development. And, there is research validating that this tends to speed up, a lot of things that we like about coding and, tends to make it better. I'm not great at reading management papers, so I can't really attest to their rigor, but I'm not sure, but in any case, it does make things a lot less painful. I can say from firsthand experience that. And basically in DevOps, you're kind of balancing these two forces. It's like a tug of war between people who are developers, who are folks that are trying to develop cool new features, and they want to build things, they want to invent, they want to, make your code better and faster, do new cool things, and people that work in operations whose main job is to keep everything running every day with no interruptions. And so for them, they don't really want change. They want things to be quite stable. And so you have to balance these two forces in any organization. And so I would say, if we were looking at this in science, the forces might be, on the one hand, I want to publish a lot. I want to write a lot of, I want to do a lot of cool studies. I want to get a lot of new data sets. I want to try out my ideas. I want to explore my data. And I want to be free to, publish often. On the other hand, we might have a force that says, science needs to be replicable. And that means that things have to be, written and codified. And, you have to take all the precautions to make sure that everything is recorded in a way you could share. Or perhaps another competing force is, perhaps you are really driven by wanting to produce tools and data that can be shared with your field. So, that you want to create something of communal value. Not that a paper isn't, but, in the way that something like a data set or a code base or a tool that's meant to be used by, many scientists in your community just has some, different priorities. So during my year at this open source startup, I got to work on how DevOps can work for data science teams. And so the two projects that I worked around are data version control, which is basically it's an open source. Open source means in this context, it's free and anybody can contribute to the code base and anybody can see the code base. Data version control, which is a tool for helping people use Git better when they have data sets. And the other tool is called continuous machine learning, which I'll share a little bit about. It's got to do with code and data testing and something called continuous integration, which I'll get into in a little bit. So, I'd kind of mentioned Git a bit, but my year out was kind of I had used Git before, but not especially well. And part of that is that I didn't really know it. And part of it is that Git is actually, I don't think it's that easy. And I think a lot of people say, oh, Git, it's easy, but it's not, it doesn't have a great user interface and it's kind of scary for a lot of new folks. And I think it is quite justifiably so. But Git is it's the tool that we have that seems to be the most effective at version control. So if you recall earlier, I talked about, we take snapshots of our code. And the way that you can do that in Git is you are in your command line and you say git add, and then a file that you want to track. And then you commit it with a commit message. So it's like you take a picture and you leave a note for yourself. And then if you were to change something in that script, you do it again. And you can leave yourself a note telling yourself that you updated it, something like that. And so in this way, you take, you just, when something changes, you record that there is a change. And what this lets you do is go back and kind of save, it saves a copy of every version of your code. And so versioning gives everybody on your team access to the whole history of the project. So at any point, I can decide that I want to look back over all of the previous versions I've had. And if we're doing this well, then my teammate can as well. And I can also see their history. But you can do much more than track code history. And so this is the really cool thing I want to show you. So this is continuous integration. And I learned all about this only when I got into industry, but it kind of blew my mind a little bit. It's one of the biggest ideas from DevOps, and it's really important to, affecting how multidisciplinary teams run. It's called continuous integration and also continuous delivery. It gets abbreviated sometimes CI or CI/CD. And what it means is that every time you change your code, so, you change your code somehow, and then you make a git commit. So you record that you've changed it. What happens is every time there's a git commit, your code is built, which means, or in this context, it would be run. So if this was like a neuroimaging pipeline, you might change a function and then it's going to run the whole, pipeline that you wrote. And it'll print out, some output of some tests. So you would define some tests that you want to run about your code. And then you get a signal. Did you pass it or did you fail? So it could be something like, how fast did this run? Is it over or under, a certain speed limit? It could be something like, I know that if I put in this data, I'm supposed to get this answer. Did it give me that? And if it gives you the right answer, the one that you expect, then you pass. And if not, then there's probably a bug somewhere in your math. And so tests, writing tests is like its own huge area. And you can write tests for things like checking data types. Is the data the type that I expect, like integer or string? Is it in the format that I expect? It could be, does my code return the answer I expect? You can probably think of a couple ways to write tests, but basically you write tests that try to prevent you from breaking anything, and they alert you if you think you've broken something, if the tests think you've broken something. And then if you fail, you can keep going on this. So the idea is that every time you change your code and you record that change, you get immediate feedback. So you're never going very long between trying out something new and discovering that it's buggy or that it breaks what you made. So the project that I worked on, which had that infinity logo, which is called Continuous Machine Learning, is another open source project. And so the idea is that we were trying to make this work even better for data science. So what we were doing was creating some software tools that help people put things like data visualization inside the feedback that you get from this loop. So here's an example, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into what GitHub Actions are, but on GitHub, there's something called GitHub Actions, and it will run the tests for you and report the results back. And we wrote these helper functions that help you deliver something like this confusion matrix. So you can get data visualization in GitHub. And I don't want to harp too much on the particular details of this open source project because it's really just one way to implement this. And you certainly don't need it. But the big idea here is that you can use tools like GitHub, and you can have your continuous integration be that every time you update something about your, maybe statistical model. That's what I did here. I was playing with the data set and I altered something about the random forest model I was doing. And then I get a report about the performance of that model on my data set, and I can see that. And it's recorded in GitHub, and everybody for the rest of, the history of the project can see that I tried this. So to give an example of how I do this. Here's a real life thing that happened pretty recently. This is kind of not a traditional, it's not like a research project per se, but it is something that I would really imagine that a lot of people who are working in bioinformatics or biomedical engineering could see themselves getting into at some point in their career. And it's that, as part of my work at the University of Michigan, we're helping out the Department of Health and Human Services, creating a dashboard designed for county public health officials to visualize vaccine rollout in their county. So to understand who's getting the vaccine, who isn't, what populations might be, underserved right now, and help them make decisions about it. And as you might imagine, this is a really big data set that is updating every day. So my role in it is that I have to create a data pipeline. So every day we're getting new data from the government. And then what I have to do with my friend, Dr. Michael Hayashi, who's an epidemiologist, and he's really good. He helps me not do things that are wrong or stupid with this data because I'm not a domain expert here. So this collaboration, I think, has been really good for both of us. And what we do is we turn the data into summary statistics, and then we have some developers who've made a beautiful front end, and they turn that into the dashboard that the public health officials can see. So we have a pipeline that is a bunch of steps of code. It's written in Python. It uses pandas. It's not a, it's a pretty average looking pipeline. I bet it works a lot like a lot of the code that many of you have that, does steps like quality controlling data, aggregating, we do some counting, and we summarize. The math is not terribly complicated, but it does take a long time simply because the volume of data that we have to do this on is quite large and it's growing. Now, the code itself is dynamic. And part of that is because sometimes I'll go in and I'll do something and then Michael will go, oh, no, we should not add those two things. That happens all the time. And then we have to update the code. But another way that this can change is something like when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine got approved, we had to go in and adjust our code to handle a vaccine that takes only 1 dose instead of 2, because we'd written all our code for 2-dose vaccines. So now we have to accommodate that. And this is likely going to keep happening throughout the year, that we're going to have, booster shots maybe in a couple months, and then we're going to have to accommodate those as well into all of our counting functions. So, every time we make a change like that, you can kind of see that we've actually changed the pipeline, and now there's multiple versions of the pipeline that are kicking around. So there's kind of a space you could think of all of the possible pipelines we could write, and it's pretty big. And this is just one of those circumstances where it's really not okay to, not know what version we're using, because if people are making decisions based on this. So it's simply not an option any of us are comfortable with, to not be tracking in some way how this is changing over time. So we use Git to track all of our code, and we use GitHub to help us test the code. So the way that this works is that every time the code changes, GitHub, through their service GitHub Actions, which is free for most, free for many uses. It will help us actually run all of our pipeline code on some dummy data and make sure it still works. So we created just a dummy data set of like, these are 10 fake, vaccine records, and we just made up, weird addresses that they came from. It's all garbage, but it's, the correct format, and it's the fields that you would expect in your data. You could do this with real data perhaps too, but because we have a lot of security issues to do with very sensitive data, we go completely, the types are the same, but it's fabricated. And so we just have like a little dummy data set. And then every time we update our code, everything gets run on that data set and the result gets reported back to us. And so it's like a benchmark that we know that if I change the code, it really shouldn't alter the math. It shouldn't alter the ultimate result unless I really intended that, in which case I could say, okay, yes, that's a code, a change I expected because I'm repairing this bug. But if I just update like the type of something, or if I, add a function that, there's a lot of functions I could add, or a lot of adjustments I could make. Like I could try to do like a speed optimization, and that should not affect the math that's coming out. So this helps us make sure of that. So the way that it works, and we also use something called a branching in GitHub. So this is one of the coolest features, and it helps people, have multiple versions of the code at once, and one of them can be in development. So in Git, I think this tree diagram has popped up a few times, but the gist here is that we have a main trunk of the tree, and that trunk is where we keep code that gets run every day by the pipeline, and is really what the code that's used to give something to the public health officials. But we can create in parallel a branch, so we branch off a little bit, and that's where we can develop a new feature. And we keep that separate until we're really sure that it's ready to go. And we don't merge it, bring it back into that main branch until we're really sure it's up to the standards that we need. So we use GitHub to help us not only track all of the versions as we go, but to help us with the testing. And so to be completely transparent about it, and because it also helps it helped me understand a lot, is that what's happening here is that GitHub actually maintains a bunch of computers, And what it can do, if you set it up to do this with GitHub Actions, is run your code on their computers and return the results to you. So they actually manage, everything about running the code. You just tell it what to run. And so here's an example of what it looks like. So we have some code. So this is on a branch that's parallel to the main branch. And Michael does a change and he gets this red X back. So this is GitHub telling him, we tried to run your pipeline and it failed. We hit an error. And then you can click on that and it'll actually take you to a log about, so you can see, what failed in particular. Then I came in and I fixed it. And then our pipeline ran successfully and we got back this feedback. So here we get, I wrote a test that if anything is different from our reference database, I wanted it to print out exactly how it was different using a pandas data frame comparison function. And it did. And it says, okay, this data type is different. And that's exactly what we wanted. That was the intention. So we're fine with this. And we're okay to merge it. And the other thing that changed is the timestamp, and we expected that. So this helps us be very clear about, are we getting the same answer out? And this is only one of many tests that you could run, because of we are also, an under-resourced, understaffed organization working on an urgent public health crisis. We don't have a lot of code quality tests. There's lots that you can do. Does the code follow a style guide? Do you use underscores where you're supposed to, or camel case? There's people write all sorts of those tests too. And there's a lot of libraries, for helping you do that. And we keep it pretty simple, but it's a lot better than nothing. So some of the important properties of this workflow to summarize. So we're using Git, and that helps us develop new features while not overwriting what we know works. So several team members can be working on making changes to their code, and Git helps you deal with those changes when it comes time to, merge them in, is how we say it. Our code runs on our computers, but because of we're always testing it, and because of we test it on GitHub Actions, which means we test it on GitHub's computers, we know it's portable. So the code can't pass the check if it can only run on my computer. It has to be able to run somewhere else. So that means that all the code, I can be pretty confident that if it can run on GitHub's computers, I can probably give it to my friend and it will run on his or her computer as well. We get fast feedback every time we check in code. So we don't tend to have I'll update something, but then I don't learn till weeks later that, it introduced a bug. We find out really quickly when you make a change that, is an error. And the other cool thing about this is I'm not dependent on anybody else to figure that out. I've definitely worked on projects where we have, a front end where something goes into production. And so I would make some code and then I'd pass it off to them and say, hey, would you let me know if this works? And then that introduces a real time delay. So I don't know, it might take days for me to figure out, did my change work or does it just throw a bug? And then it's super infuriating if it threw an error in the first minute of execution. That was really silly. And also a lot of times that person would forget or they have other things to do. And so it gives you a lot more independence as somebody to, who writes code to do this. For example, Michael Hayashi, my teammate, he is not an expert in software development, but he can now he's completely independent. Once we set this up, he writes code. If it throws an error, he finds out before we send this off, to the real machine for, the real data processing. And we usually find out within a minute or so, and then he can just take the signal, update his code and keep going. And finally, automating this way means that we never forget to test. The test happens automatically. So as long as you're in the habit of putting your code, on GitHub, anytime you change it, this will happen. So you don't forget. So there's one more benefit of this, and it's my absolute favorite, and it has to do with cloud computing. So, the portability aspect isn't just to do with the ease of sharing with collaborators. It's also got to do with your ability to take advantage of resources in the cloud. So cloud computing is just computers, but there's a lot of them and they're a lot cheaper than a lot of computers that you might, try to put in your own space. So what we do here is we put our code on GitHub So we have the main branch of the project. That's where our code lives, but not our data. Our data is super sensitive. So it goes off in, a locked, very secure, database. And so we keep them separate. But we have something called AWS Batch, and AWS Batch is it's kind of their product for just giving you a lot of compute, and it prevents you from having to do a lot of kind of low level things like installing things on the computer yourself or anything like that. It just is like, okay, we're going to give you a bunch of computers and tell us what code you want us to run on it, is kind of the idea. It's pretty big, I think, for a lot of biomedical applications. At least that's what they have on their product homepage. So they'd like it to be used for that. I don't know how much it is, but we use it. And so AWS Batch takes the code off of our GitHub repository. It takes the data from the secure database, and then it puts the two together. So it runs our code on the data, and then it returns a result to the front end. So all of this happens basically in the cloud. And so that means a couple things. It means I never have to touch the secure data. Nobody personally needs access to it. It's, the only thing that touches it is another computer. No individual has access to the raw data. But my favorite thing about it is that you can scale this pretty endlessly. So as the year goes on and our data set is getting bigger, we can just add more compute power to AWS Batch. You can just keep adding CPUs to it. And so that's pretty incredible that you're not going to be limited in 1 year when your data set's even bigger. You're limited by your budget essentially, but most cloud organizations have pretty substantial grants for, scientific applications, because to them, this is just like, they just print it like money. There's very little cost to them to provide it. So we have a grant. So this to me is just so cool that it's kind of like unlimited compute access, and it all happens automatically whenever we update our code. And just the one point I'd want to drive home is, if any of this sounds special, it's really, really, everything in the cloud is just another computer. It is just a computer that Amazon owns instead of you. And the nice thing about it is you don't have to take care of it when somebody spills a drink on it. It's just easier. Well, it's easier, but it's harder. There is definitely a learning curve, and I don't want to pretend that there isn't, and it can be really quite severe. And I think sometimes intentionally they don't make the documents easy to use, because I think they kind of want you to be reliant on them. That's my conspiracy theory. But when you do have the hang of it, scaling up this way, saying I'm going to need a bunch more computers as my data set grows, is a lot easier than buying more computers that you're going to keep around. So I guess my hope, I know of a couple labs that are starting to use continuous integration. And I'm not positive it will work for everybody, or even most people, anybody, but my hope is that it could be an effective way to help us test and visualize new data. So perhaps every time new data comes in, you would automatically run some tests and some reporting on it. So you kind of get, a report about, okay, do we have drift? Are the values what we'd expect? How much data is missing? So if you have an ongoing experiment, you can use a workflow like this to be testing not just your code, but your data. You can test new ways of processing data against some benchmark results. So if you're experimenting, on an alternate data processing pipeline, you can check it and then have kind of like a standard against which you're going to compare it. So just help you keep tabs on how changing your code is changing your results, just in a more rigorous way than just doing a bunch of experiments on your local computer and then just saving at the end of the day. And then you kind of forget all the things you tried. It can help you write tests to catch common errors. So confidence checks. So if you know that, one field in your data plus another is supposed to be equal to another, or something like that, you can kind of write some confidence checks like, or, these two values should always be less than this, take your domain knowledge and you can turn that into some tests. And then, if your data is, if your pipeline is running and it's coming out with something really funky, then maybe that suggests that there's either a miscalculation or your data has some, some questionable values in it. And the importance of this grows with the size of your data. When you can manually inspect your data, you don't need this so much. I still think it has a place because automating things, helps you remember to do them. But it really becomes an issue when your data is so large that you can't manually inspect it anymore. And finally, you can test your code to make sure that it works on different operating systems, or computing environments. And so basically, anytime that everything I've shown here, anytime we test it and it passes, that is, in theory, something that I could share, and I can be reasonably confident that I have packaged up effectively, like these are the libraries it needs, this is the Python version it needs. I kind of have those things recorded explicitly. And it's, something that runs off my computer. And that's good for publishing your code, but it's also good for getting you in a state that you can take advantage of things like the cloud. So if you were to bring on somebody into your lab, perhaps who's, really going to help you start taking advantage of AWS or build an app or something, it's easier for them to jump in and help. So how do we get to this place in science, if you agree with me that this is even the place we should go? There are so many tools out there. There's version control, many choices there. Git's my favorite, but there are others. Computing infrastructure is getting cheaper every year, and I am starting to see more and more labs that build everything into cloud compute. I still see that as having some serious user interface hurdles and such for a lot of labs, but it could be a big part of many labs depending on their needs. Dependency management, so keeping track of all of the software, and libraries that go into making your code run. There's a lot of tools here, mainly because of Python is just so difficult and poses so many challenges, but people in those communities have really developed things like virtual environments and Docker. There's also a lot of tools for automated code and data testing. So things like GitHub Actions and GitLab continuous integration. But I kind of want to emphasize that I don't think this is really where the problem is. There are all these tools. They all have a bit of a learning curve, although if you're very curious, a lot of times you can get quite far on your own, kind of depending on, how much tolerance you have for sitting around and getting errors for a while until it works. But I really think that this is not the problem. There are a lot of tools and they're very widely adopted in a lot of, software centric companies out there. And I used to think that the right move was to go and teach all of my friends about this, but very quickly I realized this it didn't work as well as I thought. I thought if I could just get people excited about these tools, they'd want to use them, but people don't. It's kind of a struggle because of when I would talk to people about it, they go, okay, well, this is great, but I don't really have time to do this. I'm just trying to graduate and I don't get any extra credit for doing this. And that's true of me as well. I mean, when I was graduating, I put my code up on GitHub, but was it really that well maintained? When I look back at it now, it's not really up to the standard that I would want. And I think a big part of that is that I had a huge financial incentive to graduate early, because the sooner I graduated, the faster I could go to my tech job, get my tech salary, and pay off my, frankly, enormous student loans. So I wasn't going to spend another 6 months kicking around and writing documentation for code that somebody may or may not use and that I didn't need to graduate. So, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think people have very rational responses to the actual job incentives that they have. And if you don't really get it much other than, a sense of doing it well, out of this, then I don't think that is a very good reason to, expect people to do this. People have other pressures in their lives. And so the way I kind of see this now, and I'm, very open to discussing this because I have a hunch I could still use a lot of refining my thinking about this, but I think that this is kind of an infrastructure problem in the same way that building roads are, or building housing, that if we want technically complex research to succeed and reach its full potential, we have to incentivize it. And I think that means partially investing in developing expertise within our community. So, that means that we could, train people in these things more explicitly. but also reward them for doing it. You know, I don't think that everybody needs to be like a Git aficionado. I don't think that's really the goal. I think it's that if a couple people get really into that and they want to stay in the community, we can reward them for being somebody who has this domain knowledge and also, you know, really knows how to take advantage of these tools, you know, kind of in the way that we might reward them for learning a scientific technique. And so this includes things like, you know, it would be great if we had people in our community that, you know, understand and, you know, are pretty proficient in cloud computing, web and mobile development, or data engineering. I think a lot of times these get kind of classed off as like, oh, well, we could just hire an engineer to do that. But as I found working on this COVID dataset project, it's quite hard to just bring in somebody with no technical expertise and be like, okay, well, just make this, you know, no domain expertise. They have the technical expertise, but they don't have the domain. We'd constantly find, you know, errors or miscommunications. Like, you really do need liaisons between those. And I think that, you know, there's a real, I want there to be long-term roles for people who are great at both. And that means long-term research engineering roles. I kind of see an issue with, you know, if somebody's an excellent research engineer, the salaries are just so much higher in tech that I don't know if there's a lot of incentive to stay and contribute. And so I kind of see this as, you know, at a federal level, we have to invest in the expertise that we want to see here, that if we want to be able to create, you know, world-class apps for biomedical data collection, you know, you need an app developer, you know, and you want that person there long-term. You want them to have a long-term stake in your project, not to be, you know, necessarily a contractor. You know, that's kind of how I see that working out well. And I could see, you know, these long-term research engineers kind of like a data or machine learning engineer being somebody that's shared by a department or multiple labs, or they could be dedicated to one lab. You know, and I see these increasing, but I oftentimes also see them kind of positioned as roles that are maybe more temporary. They look like they're for a student who's kind of, you know, considering if they want to go to grad school. And that's really great. But I think that we need, you know, some permanent people, and we want to create jobs that inspire people to want to stay there a long time. And also incentivizing shared resources like data sets, software tools, and computing power across labs, departments, and research hubs. So, you know, if you're going to collect a lot of data, there's tremendous value in being able to share that. So getting it into a format where it's ready to be used by other people, you know, I think that's a tremendous value to the community. But as long as those contributions are less valued than a paper, then I think it's quite hard to incentivize them. So I really see this as another place where, you know, broadening the definition of what it means to succeed away from an individual lab to, you know, how are you supporting your community, is something I'm particularly interested in. And I do see communities that are doing this. I've really seen in neuroimaging a lot of work going into things like data standards, you know, and it's really inspiring. And I'm you know, hoping that that catches and that institutions start valuing in the same way that some communities are beginning to. And finally, my last point, at the level of academic communities, you know, professional societies, we can create standards for data and model sharing. It is more work to create a standard in the beginning, but when you create a standard, it also relieves people of some work down the road, because if you've done all the work of saying, okay, this is the format it needs to get to, this is how we publish data, and then, you know, everybody who wants to learn how to use their data has a common standard to rely on. So the last point I'd like to make is that I really see this as a cultural and economic issue, not so much a technical one. And so my question is, how will we incentivize doing our research well? And at this point, I would love to take questions, comments, and discuss.
Great, thank you for that tour de force, Elle. So if I'm going to talk for just a little bit, I don't know if you need a break or not, because we're going to go to the second. I'm going to drink some water. Yeah, feel free to do that while I comment a little bit. Often you don't get, the speaker doesn't get the feedback of what's happening behind the scenes with these virtual settings. It's just easier for the audience to interact. And I can tell you, I've got several side chats going on of like jaw-dropping, whoa, this is exactly what my lab needs, or this is something I wish I knew before. So I can tell you for sure that for part of the audience, that at least the ones that I'm communicating with, this content is resonating, and it's
Cool.
from across disciplines, from human cognitive neuroimaging to neurophysiology to more data science applications. So that's absolutely happening. Just in case anyone has to leave now or soon, we are recording this. This will be in the CCSN archives.